Okay, this looks like it's happening. Hello, everyone. Uh, it's Sunday night here. You've finished up your reading week. You're heading into your first new week, um, and I'm going to be doing a lecture on the war poets, on the fact of World War One. I'm going to try and tie it into how it was in a way, the war was that rough beast slouching toward Bethlehem. There's a lot of premonitions, no predictions really in Dorian Gray or Heart of Darkness um, or Dubliners to say, okay, well, the war is coming. But once the war hit, and once it hit the way that it did, um, we can see foreshadowings of what will happen. Seeing Kurtz stumble all the way up the river, trying to justify uh, more and more destruction by fantasizing about some end that would make it all worthwhile. The World War I was named early on the war to end all wars, and it was this astonishing hubris on the part of the participants that they were just going to hash it out once and for all. That somehow centuries of various conflicts would just be settled. And amazingly, they seem to think they'd do it in a matter of months. Every involved nation, primarily Germany, England, France, Canada, which came in with England, America, which came in later, the last year or so of the conflict from 1914 to 1919. In the end, after those 4 years, approximately 20 million people dead and nothing different, except that Germany had surrendered, which meant that at the Treaty of Versailles, the countries that had won, whatever that means, got to set terms, and they pretty much blamed Germany for the war, which is something you can do. I mean, when you win a war, you can blame the people you defeated for having started it. And Germany certainly did have a big role to play in starting the war, but they were not alone. But they were the ones who lost, and they were the ones who were forced to surrender. So, among other things, they were heavy war reparations. They essentially wanted Germany's economy to pay back the other nations for the cost of the war, something that Germany's economy, even running at full tilt, couldn't really do. So they set up a nation that was working at a top speed economy, but essentially an impoverished nation because all the money was going out. This was known as the Weimar Republic, and roughly between 1919 and 19, I think it varies depending on when Hitler takes absolute power, but 1933, I think, 1933 is the end of the Weimar Republic because Hitler now has enough political power to take apart the old government and begin to build what would become the dictatorship of Nazi Germany. So having plunged Germany into desperate straits for decades, they laid the groundwork for the country to elect their own rough beast, to give everything to a single dictator who could then build an incredible army and take on the rest of Europe again. World War II began when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. And some historians make the case that World War II is less a second World War and more the resumption of World War I, because nothing was really resolved, and the intervening years weren't used to set up equitable terms among nations. So when Germany could begin the war again, so to speak, they had nothing to lose. So we'll be getting more into that later in the course, because the course will end with Good Morning Midnight, Jean Rhys, written in 1937, Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, a movie made in 1937. But now I'm taking us back to 1914. So Dubliners was essentially finished by 1908, but it didn't get published until 1914. Um, and Heart of Darkness was 1900. Uh, the epiphany that we talked about, the sudden crashing, um, your belief system that the boy's on his way to Araby to get the present for the girl he loves, and this gives him a feeling of confidence. It gives him a mission. It gives him a direction and a purpose, and it all falls apart in a matter of really moments. And the boy is standing outside. His uncle kept him too late. It's already almost 10. The place is closing down. He can't seem to afford anything. He put in the expensive entrance because he was desperate to get in there at all. The place seems way more cheap, and just hears the sound of money everywhere. It seems like a desecrated church, not sacred. And he ends by saying, I stared up into the darkness and saw myself as a creature derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with tears of anguish and anger. So that collapse, that sudden collapse, that's just a boy with a crush on a girl. But imagine that happening to Europe. And remember that Conrad's already told us all of Europe went into the making of Kurtz. So Kurtz's collapse is a collapse of one man. But again, imagine the collapse of Europe. Because Kurtz and these various structures, the collapse of Dorian Gray, which happened suddenly, is a premonition of something like World War I. I mean, he was doing fine, and then he wanted everything, and he wanted to not understand anything, and he wanted to use people as much as he could. And it all came back in one instant. He stabbed the painting. He went from being a handsome young man to a loathsome ancient corpse with a knife in his chest that they couldn't even recognize, except for the rings on his fingers, is what we're told. And the same with Kurtz, this noble man. He went out there. He was going to write the history of the people. All of a sudden, it's exterminate the brutes, the horror. And, Marlowe saves it at the end by lying to the fiancée and saying, when she says, well, tell me his last words. What were his last words to live by? And he says, oh, his last words were your name. And she's like, I know, I was sure, I knew it. And she was sure she knew it. We're looking at the end point of how much ideology, which is a form of denial. We're coming to the ragged end of the Pepsiness, actually, even though they're still here, as you know from looking at your ads. Particularly what we're really coming to the end of is science as the new religion. Because science has imitated religion very well, and it has made remarkable advances. What nobody really noticed is that all of the innovation, myth of innovation, and the progress, things were getting better and better between the Civil War, let's say, the last major war in the world, in the American Civil War, 1863, which was a relatively modern war. They had guns, they had, and there was this slaughter reached levels that had never been seen before in 1863. So in Gettysburg, tens of thousands of people dying in a single day. That was virtually impossible in previous wars. You couldn't kill people that fast. And so the Civil War in 1863 was already seen as a war that the tactics being used were from the last war. So, and the weapons had never been seen before. So the advances in bullets, for instance, in the Civil War made a huge difference. They went twice as far and about 4 times as accurate. And yet the troops still fought as if they were fighting the last war. So they would march toward each other and just mow each other down. So their weapons were so much overwhelmed tactics that made sense with much less effective weapons. That happened again, but much, much worse in World War I, because the innovation of war machinery was taking place across the entire spectrum, and more than that, in the Civil War, you basically didn't really have trains yet, and you didn't have airplanes, and you had a bit of steam power, but there wasn't that same capacity to move around heavy equipment, for instance. So cannons were very heavy, and it would take a couple of horses to move a cannon from one position to another. Um, and even then, all the cannon could do was fire an inert heavy metal ball, which could break down a wall or mow down 10, maybe 20 people. But the cannonball itself didn't explode. So in World War One, they had high-speed artillery, and for the first time had something that we now call shrapnel, where it wasn't just the missile itself was almost incidental, completely different than the cannonball. Like with the cannonball, whatever damage it did as an inert object. But with high-speed artillery, nobody much cared about the shell. It was the explosion, which cannonballs didn't have. I mean, you exploded the cannon to project the cannonball out, but that had nothing to do with inflicting damage. And also the cannonballs couldn't go very far. So artillery not only could explode with shrapnel, it would go up to a mile versus, I don't know, a couple hundred yards for a cannonball, and usually one that had to be perched up on a hill to even do that. So then there was the improvement in weaponry. Rifles, certainly, for the first time they had steel bullets, which were 4 times as accurate as what was used in the Civil War. Plus, they were able to put lead tips on the end of the silver bullets, which meant that it too, when it entered the body, created a shrapnel. The lead would shatter inside the body, making the wound 10 times worse than being shot in the Civil War. And remember, we're only talking about 40 years here, 45 years between Civil War, World War I. And those were just sniper guns. Then they had something that had only just barely was beginning to be seen toward the very end of the Civil War. It was called a Gatling gun, invented by a guy named Gatlin. But it was heavy and it was cumbersome, but it was an early machine gun. But it didn't have very much range. By World War I, the machine guns were still heavy, but they could be carried by one person, maybe another person to carry the ammunition instead of 4 or 5 people plus a horse and so on, as in the case of the Gatling gun. And also the Gatling gun could fire about 12 shots in 30 seconds and then had to be reloaded, which would take about at least 10 minutes. Whereas machine guns, they could feed them cartridges. The Gatling gun would just go in a circle and shoot each time the circle came around. So they, but with the machine gun, you would have ammunition here. You'd have a slot for the machine gun, and it just go, the spent charges coming out that side, and the new ammunition coming in this side. So you didn't even have to aim anymore, because you could lay down a spray of repressed fire that would pretty much hit anything that was coming toward it. So very quickly, and then you have to remember that the generals had no idea of how effective the weaponry would be. And added to that was a very innocuous invention. It's like literally just made out of wire. It had no weapon potential. It was called barbed wire. And of course, you've seen it. And it itself doesn't do anything, but it's wire with lots of barbs on it, which means that in addition to being out in the open, as soldiers tried to run toward the next to engage the other side, not only is the machine gun fire mowing them down, but they can't get through the barbed wire. So they're trying to crawl under it, they're trying to get over it, they're trying to get through it, but because it's so barbed, it's not just wire, it catches on their uniforms, and so which slows them down. So in a sense, barbed wire may have killed more people than any other single device in World War I by doing nothing except holding soldiers up in plain view long enough to be thoroughly slaughtered by the machine gun fire. And so with early in the war, they still thought this was going to be a war fought mostly by horses. Well, that ended very quickly, because horses obviously get hit by bullet fire too. And so they realized that they needed to dig down, to dig a trench. And the other side dug a trench. And this became known for the first time as trench warfare, where you had both sides who had to dig down so they couldn't be seen because they'd just be annihilated. But you still had artillery fire that could be lobbed across the field. And another invention was radio and an improvements in optics so that both sides could have people who would watch through binoculars and then radio to the ammunitions people how close they were to their target. Because there was no way to really see from your trench who and what was going on in the other trench. And then the other thing that no war had ever seen before was aerial surveillance. The airplanes were very new. They could seat 2 or 3 people. They weren't particularly effective for bombing. That would be a huge factor in World War II. But they couldn't take much of a payload. But so their primary contribution was simply giving a bird's eye view of the battlefield. So the radio wouldn't always work. So the plane would fly over the enemy trenches too high to be shot down, and then land, and then they would report where is the best place to hit along trenches that were literally 20, 30 miles long. So you could have a bunch of troops here and nothing here, and you could be bombing nothing, or you could be bombing troops. So that increased the accuracy. Then they tried to use chlorine gas to kill people in the trenches without having to go up and run and go down into the trenches. And that was too light a gas. So it worked if the wind was blowing toward the enemy trench, but it was just as likely for the wind to shift into the chlorine gas would blow back into your own the troop's face. But innovation, they developed something that became mustard gas because it was yellowish and it was a much heavier gas. So it wasn't as if, and it could be put in bombs. So they didn't have to try and push it out across the battlefield. They would just drop it into trenches, and it would not come up out of the trench, or at least not that much, because it was a heavy gas. And it was essentially corrosive to the lungs. It didn't kill you. It rarely killed you right in the middle of the gas attack, but it would kill if you couldn't get your gas mask on in time. And we'll see this with one of the poems we're reading. If you breathed in a lot, you'd die by the end of the day. But you also could just breathe in some, and you might die a week later. Or breathe in not too much at all, but have permanent lung damage and die a decade later, or even 20 years later. So sort of an industrial thing like asbestos. So it wasn't even just how many people did the mustard gas kill when we dropped it, because it would stress the resources of the other side by very sick men who were dying and would either have to go back and convalesce and maybe come back to the front and maybe not. And the other major killer was infection, and that was happening at an unprecedented rate because the trench warfare made the men were living on top of each other. So sepsis and infection, there were rats everywhere, feeding on corpses like all night and all day. There was, literally 10, 20, 30,000 men could die in one day in the Battle of the Somme and some of the other big battles. So there was vermin everywhere. There's never had been so much food. It's a horrible way to put it, but that's what it was for them. And on top of that, let's see, the area between the trenches where no one could seem to cross without getting hit became known as no man's land, because no man could be out there for any length of time without being cut down. So what this also meant, and this is unprecedented, is that it was a war where you couldn't go really get your wounded. It was such a mean war in that sense. I mean, in the Crimean War or even the Civil War, there was an understanding when the battle was over, you could go and see if you could find any wounded that you could help. But because there was no beginning or end to no man's land, like it wasn't like Gettysburg where they clashed for 3 days and then the fight was over. It just never stopped all day, all night, and they could bomb all night, which was made couldn't fight at night in the Civil War. You literally, I mean, it'd be like Matthew Arnold's ignorant armies clashing in the dark, but you could bomb all night. You could even try and charge trenches. There were certainly men who would do they would crawl across no man's land and try and lob grenades into the opposing trenches, which is virtually suicidal. But um, so so that also meant that you would hear men crying out they were wounded, they were dying of thirst, they were bleeding to death. They would be the friends of the people in the trenches who either listened to them die or tried to go out there and more often than not wound up dying or dead with them. So it was like the closest thing to hell that anyone had ever seen on Earth. And this slaughter was so, how did this affect literature? Because we are getting to that. And I mentioned The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which was a movie that was made in 1919 at the end of the war, written and directed by a German soldier who survived the war. And it's an allegory of the nightmare of the war. And I'm not going to say too much about it tonight just because I want to give you a little extra time to watch it. But it's only 74 minutes. I put a good copy on for you. It's been all cleaned up by various film experts and looks pretty good I mean, you'll be shocked. It's a silent movie. It's 100 years old this year, really, 2020, which is kind of cool. I think that's the other reason I wanted to do it. The 100th anniversary of this film, seen as one of the greatest films of the entire silent era. And I'm probably prejudiced because I love movies, but it's weird. I won't say it holds up exactly because that sounds kind of crazy. It's got subtitle cards, but you'll see that it creates a mood, and it's very expressionistic. You'll remember that all the way back to my first lecture that I talked about how there's a shift from the soul to the self is also a shift to everything becoming subjective. Things are what they are because that's what they are to you. That's not necessarily what they, quote, are. I mean, they may be something apart from what you think, but you can't know what that is other than how you think about it. So there is that shift. Famously, Lord Henry? No, it's actually Basil, who says every portrait is a portrait of the artist who paints it. So that's the beginning of expressionism and impressionism, where you can draw a portrait of your best friend, paint a portrait, but the way you paint it will say more about you, the one who painted it, than it will say about the one who was painted. And that's what Basil freaks out. Basil, he says, I put too much of my soul in it, because he's still an old-fashioned guy trying to hang out with the age of faith. And he's really a modern artist and won't accept it. He wants to be a late Victorian artist, still trying to paint God's truth, and not wanting to deal with the fact that his paintings are exposing himself. So Caligari is an example of German expressionism, and one of the things they'd done that had never been done in cinema before was that they built sets that are all distorted. You'll notice that there's hardly a straight right angle in the entire movie. Like the hallways are weird, the windows aren't square, and basically you're inside the mind of a madman, and you're seeing. And this reminds me of Dubliners. It's the visual equivalent of indirect discourse, because you see through the subjectivity of an insane point of view. So you don't see there probably is a square window there, but you never see a square window because it's not what the person whose point of view you're forced to share sees. They see a twisted, tilted world. So I thought that would be worth walking through. So, but how does this affect literature? But this is really the rough piece. This is everything that everyone's been warning about and everything that we've read so far. Something's going to give. And part of how did World War I happen? Nobody expected it to explode like that. And And if I were told you, well, it happened because some archduke got assassinated in Sarajevo, you'd say, what? I mean, okay, too bad for the archduke, but 20 million people, how the heck is that how does that, set off a world war? So obviously it's just a fuse. It set off. It's like they had mined this to blow and they didn't even know it. Mainly it had been mined by alliances. The big countries, all of which had colonies, all of which had become incredibly enriched by these colonies, so much so they didn't even know what to do with all the money, like Belgium. And so one of the things they did is they built up their military, not necessarily to go to war, but just to do it. And it was really one of the first arms races because England had by far the biggest navy, 4 times bigger than any other European navy. So Germany decided to see if they could at least catch up. Not so much to invade England, but as to be equal to it. So Germany started building a much bigger navy, but England, of course, freaked out, even though they were bigger, and they weren't going to wait until Germany caught up. So they started pouring all their money from India and elsewhere into doing the navy. So by the end of it, Germany had caught up a little, but both navies were huge. And it was almost like they were all dressed up and had nowhere to fight. So that was a dangerous situation. You had incredibly powerful militaries and a lot of equipment. And everyone kept saying, well, we're just, and you hear this today, well, we're just doing it in case we have to defend ourselves. Maybe some people believe that, but the fact is, you've got this war machine in every single country that is becoming more and more capable. And then you have smaller things, like, so the big countries, everything had gotten so fast. In other words, with trains, you could get soldiers into an attack position in a day, which you could mobilize tens of thousands of troops in a matter of hours, whereas in Civil War and certainly in earlier wars, it would take days and days of marching. So it wouldn't be that hard in the past. You'd have at least a week, 2 weeks, even 3 weeks to realize that the other side is amassing their army in what looks like an attack formation. So you've got time to say, knock it off, or we're doing it too, and then you can build up. But this is where the myth of progress, the way that time, quote unquote, accelerates. Now, because an army and it could be put in an attack formation in a matter of hours, that meant that everybody was super paranoid, really jumpy, like, because you could lose the war in a week if you failed to meet the mobilization of the other side, because they'd just be pouring over, just unleashing all their bombs and everything they have at you before you can get your act together. So who's going to strike first? And if you get struck, you want to, or you think you're about to get struck, you might strike first because you're so convinced that you're going to get hit anyway. And added to that was the invention of the telegram, which was not really operational in earlier wars. So you could get messages to people, almost pretty much instantaneously. It was an early telephone. It was a tap, 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 and then someone had to translate it, but it still was pretty fast. And so that meant you could send out instructions. So with trains and telegrams, it meant people could amass very quickly. So one of the things they tried to do diplomatically was, okay, we need time. So they went to the smaller countries that didn't have much of an army, Belgium, for instance, and said, we're going to make a treaty with you. And if you get invaded, we will come to your defense. Not because they cared that much about these smaller states, but they saw them as buffer states. In other words, if a big country invaded this little country, now they're on your doorstep. So this was a way to set up a kind of lever system where tripwires, if you will, that you're in Belgium, okay, we're at war. We're not going to wait until you're in Germany. We're not going to wait until you're in France. So that's where Sarajevo came in, weirdly enough, because it wasn't a particularly important geopolitical place, but it was like this domino effect, or whatever that, with those games where you pull out a stick and then see what happens. Jenko, I think, is one of them. So when this Archduke got assassinated, and it was a kind of a protest against the monarchy, and it was fairly local, actually, but problem is there were all these alliances. So Russia came in and said, "You got to do this, 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 and this, or we're going to war." And Germany said the same, and France had demands, and it was so complicated that the demands couldn't get met. And then everybody started playing this cat and mouse game of we're not mobilizing. What do you mean you're not mobilizing? We saw a train coming somewhere. Yeah, but it didn't have soldiers in it. How do we know? So everybody mobilized. And of course, once everybody mobilized, it just diplomacy was done. It was over. You couldn't stop the mobilization, and so it really was a rough peace slouching at that point. And then this unholy hell was unleashed for 4 years. Nobody could win. Everyone was in trenches. 30,000 people would die gaining 400 yards, which they would lose. They would lose another 40,000, and the other side would get the 400 yards back. But nobody was breaking through to end the war. It became something else that had never been seen before. It became a war of attrition, where it was clear that the side that was going to win, or the side that was going to have to surrender, would be the side that had no more soldiers. So, literally like wipe out every eligible soldier, and the other side would have to stop because they literally wouldn't have any people left. So it wasn't even about strategy anymore. It was about being bled by. So really Germany surrendered after America came into the war, because the upsurge of fresh soldiers was too much. Germany was sending 14-year-olds to the front, trying to resupply the ferocious death rate. So one of the effects on all this was it shattered, in terms of culture, and the literature begins to reflect this, is it really did shatter hegemonic discourse. It destroyed. It's not like we didn't restore this to a certain extent, but it destroyed the full sense that science was the new religion, because science could bring you things that were remarkable, and it could bring you things that could kill you, and it could kill you as efficiently as it could help you. Trains were amazing, but they could bring troops, they could bring bombs, and we would not fully learn the lesson, because the atomic bomb, obviously, in World War II, also an incredible feat of scientific engineering that destroyed 60,000 people in an instant, in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So, if you forget that that's people, it's an incredible achievement, but it's also almost beyond human comprehension. So I want to look at some poems that I've put up for you. I did a separate post in the announcements. The first one I want to read is actually called "Who's for the Game," and this is the kind of patriotic, what we call jingoism. It's written by a woman named Jessie Pope. That it's very rah, like war is amazing. It's where boys become men. It's where nations assert their superiority. And this was the beginnings of the war, was full of this, but then the absolute slaughter, unremitting, relentless slaughter to no clear purpose, it would eventually begin to make these poems look almost crazy. So one of the ways that hegemonic discourse, dominant discourse, gets shattered is it starts to sound insane. Normally, hegemonic discourse is sanity, and then anything that goes against it is seen as crazy. And I don't think this is unknown in the Trump era right now, as we watch the final days of electioneering, where you have a Trump administration that's been trying to control the dominant discourse for the last 4 years, and they're more and more crazy, for better word, at the debates and so on. But anyway, here's it's called "Who's for the Game." Jessie Pope was a very highly published, not a very good, really a jingoist, not a great poet in sense of being a poetry, but a good sloganeer, which was seen as, in a way, more important. The poem "Who's for the Game," she does what we call an extended metaphor. So the war becomes a game. Now that's obviously a problem. But it suits it. What it allows one to do is once you accept this shift, like let's talk about a game as though let's talk about excuse me about a war as if it's the Super Bowl. And really, the Super Bowl is a kind of it mimics war, but people are getting killed, so we can actually watch it, enjoy it. Sort of maybe the halftime show, as long as it's Beyonce. But some of those halftime shows aren't so good. um, but there's something militaristic about American football, for sure, which is okay. It's a game, but to call a war a game, that's obviously much more problematic because the quarterback doesn't get sacked. The quarterback would get blown up if we're really going to extend the metaphor. So, but this doesn't extend the metaphor. This is basically appealing to, come on, let's play football. They got a team. Let's go. We got to give it everything. We got to leave it all on the field. Well, that's one thing when you're a football team, and when it's no man's land, leaving it all on the field means you don't get off. You never come back. Who's for the game, the biggest it's played? The red crashing game of a fight. Who will grip and tackle the job, unafraid? And who thinks he'd rather sit? So notice this simple binary setup here. Are you a brave or are you a coward? Well, machines don't distinguish. This is the other weird thing about World War One is notions of bravery that you might have for, say, a sword fight, or as you see in the Hollywood westerns, let's say a duel at high noon. There's some kind of bravery, maybe, and you got to be brave enough to take your chance. And there's a lot of in this skill. All the skill had gone into the weaponry. It was like the weapons were fighting the war. This was a war of machines. And yeah, you needed to know how a machine gun worked, and you needed to know how to unjam one or how to load a high artillery shell. Those were important skills, but they were totally different. It wasn't the same as being brave enough to face somebody with a sword and hope that you could prevail, or have to get close enough because the rifles weren't very good in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War. The famous line, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes." That was partly good advice because you were almost certain to miss if you shoot before they were close. But that also meant and bayonets. They had bayonets on World War One guns, but they very quickly realized getting close enough to bayonet each other. And so that kind of hand-to-hand combat, it happens still in World War One. And you can see it in a movie called 1917 that came out last year, which I recommend. I'm not a scientist, but I recommend it if you want to see trench warfare in a fictionalized setting, but quite accurate. And okay, so who thinks he'd rather sit tight? Who'll toe the line for the signal to go? Who'll give his country a hand? Who wants to turn in the show? So here's a second metaphor. It's not just a game, but it's like a Broadway musical. Who wants to get on stage? This is your time. People are going to notice you. Well, why would you give up this opportunity to get on the world stage, which the war was in a sense? And who wants a seat in the stand? Who knows it won't be a picnic? Not much, yet eagerly shoulders a gun. And again, a false comparison. It wasn't just not a picnic. It was a slaughter, tens of thousands of people. So to say that, it's like a picnic where it might rain, not really. Who would much rather come back with the crutch than lie low and be out of the fun? I mean, that doesn't even make sense. This is so fun. You're gonna come back with the crutch. Why would you want to miss that? And it's so it's getting trivialized. Because first of all, 20 million people didn't come back with a crutch. They didn't come back at all. And most of them never even got a burial. They were in the Battle of the Somme and some of the others. The churning, it rained for days and days and days, and the artillery chewed up the dirt and the land and the mud. People literally drowned in the mud. Their final cause of death was drowning in many instances, and no one could go out and get them. They're still out there. I mean, many of the graveyards you see at World War One, people now, certainly dead soldiers are awarded their tombstone, but they're not even under it. And this will add to the cultural trauma that we're going to be seeing in the next 3 lectures, really, with Mrs. Dalloway. The trauma, not just that, let's say your son died, but you'll never see the body. There's no closure, and so many people died. What kind of time was there to grieve, to have masses and masses of people dying? So, and everyone's saying, look, we can't afford to grieve. Just just soak it up, suck it up, buttercup, or whatever that phrase is. We got to keep going. And there was massive trauma, and I'll talk a lot more about what trauma is more specifically. Then come along, lads, but you'll come on all right, for there's only one course to pursue. Your country is up to her neck in a fight, and she's looking and calling for you. This would be repeated in the famous Uncle Sam Wants You posters that many of you may have seen. So everything's left out of this: death, destruction, and certainly something that became known as shell shock, which will particularly concern us in this class, because also tens of thousands of soldiers who weren't physically or not that physically injured seemed incapable of getting out of bed and going back to the fight. Now we would call this post-traumatic stress disorder. They didn't know what to call it, so initially they called it shell shock because they developed this theory that they must have got a concussion from the high artillery shells because they couldn't see what was wrong with them. They had no sort of understanding of the cultural fact that these men had broken. They'd seen too much. They'd seen their friends blown up next to them, and they were just disabled by the horror. But they hung on to this older idea of bravery. So many of these shell shock victims were seen as cowardly. Quite a few soldiers were executed by their own troops for desertion. So if they could not face it anymore, many would try and run away, and they would be shot by their own men. Sometimes in firing squads, and sometimes just on the field. The Germans in particular, although it's probably not fair to pick on them because it was more in World War II, but they would set up machine guns behind the lines of their own people so that the soldiers knew to go forward to the machine guns in front of them. They would have to turn back to the machine guns behind them, aimed by their own countrymen. So this idea is bravery doesn't really even begin to touch on this. I mean, yeah, it's brave to go up over the top and start running across no man's land. It takes an incredible amount of guts, but the bravery is not going to keep the bullets from mowing you down. So it's not like that extra bit of bravery will allow you to dodge bullets. It'll allow you to come up over come up the steps, go out into no man's land when you realize that the last wave of men who did that didn't come back. There's that moment in Game of Thrones toward the end, all of the next to last episode of Game of Thrones, where they should have ended the series, but where this entire army goes out to get the king of the ice or whatever he's called, and all their torches just go out, and then they have to like realize that, wow, that whole first wave is gone. So Wilfred Owen, who was a soldier in World War I, and Siegfried Sassoon are two of the best. They met each other actually convalescing in the Craig Lockhart Hospital, which was a hospital behind the lines, with a lot of shell shock victims, a lot of people with broken legs, amputated limbs, but also shell shock. And they met there. They were both poets, and they shared their writing and changed poetry because they couldn't come up with high flying metaphors for what this war was. They were in it. They had to start writing poetry. They had to change poetry. War poetry had never been written like this. The one I just read you, although not a great example, is still a kind of war poem that you can trace all the way back to the Odyssey, the Iliad, of bravery and Achilles and Ulysses and to fight, to conquer, not to yield, or the Charge of the Light Brigade by Tennyson, into the Valley of Death rode the 5,000, whatever it was. That was presented as bravery, but in fact it's something, and it says poem, someone had blundered. In the charge of the Light Brigade, they were all cut down by cannons on both sides because it was really stupid maneuver. They got sent to their death. But Tennyson writes it as this is what men do. Theirs was not to reason why, theirs was but to do and die. And that's presented as what men do. You could certainly rewrite that poem, but if it would, because that happened in World War I. Generals were blundering, and tens of thousands of people were being blown to pieces. And it wasn't just that Tennysonian, this is what we do, this is nobility, this is war and peace and all that. It just couldn't hold up to mechanical slaughter. So Owen actually wrote this poem called Duce et Decorum Est in response to the poem I just read you. And originally it said to Jesse Pope. And I don't know if he thought that was a little mean or what, but he took out the epigraph to Jesse Pope. And Owen's title is the beginning of a line by Horace, a Roman poet, called How Sweet It Is to Die for One's Country. Honoria Patri is the rest of the line. And that's exactly what gets loaded in Will. It isn't sweet to die for one's country. It's grotesque. It's awful. It's a mechanical shell lobbed by somebody who doesn't even see you, and then you're obliterated, and then you do the same. And machines are blowing up people on both sides. And so what Owen does, of course, is toward the end of the poem, he'll address Pope, although not by name, and say, if you'd seen what I just described to you, then you would never be able to write a poem like Who's for the Game. So it begins bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we curse through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Now notice that Owen doesn't call these people cowards. In fact, they're very brave. They've just been hammered, shattered, and beyond human endurance, and they're still somehow putting one foot in front of the other. So he's not. These are not wimps. But it's like they're in this hell that it doesn't matter. That's not going to be able to address. They're not going to be able to overcome this just by being brave. Most of the men that are walking there, they're not going to live. In fact, and then when the gas shells come in, and we get the next stanza, gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy, a fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. And if you've ever seen these gas masks, there's a great war museum in London, Imperial War Museum. They were really primitive, and they got all these straps and latches, and it's hard to imagine poisonous gases dropping on you. You can try and put this thing over your face. To put them over the horses too. They had gas masks for the horses because obviously they have lungs, and they would be killed by the. So what do? Do you put the mask on yourself and let your horse die? Do you put the mask on the horse and hope you got time to get it on yourself? So most people fit the clumsy helmets just in time, but of course not everybody, and that's the next line. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling. They may not have had the mask close enough to hand. And floundering like a man in fire or lime, dim through the misty panes and thick green light. Now that's the point of view. We're looking through the thick green light gas mask, which had these heavily tinted green lenses to look out. So now we're inside a gas mask in this poem. As under a green sea, I saw him drowning. A beautiful, terrible use of metaphor there, that everything looks like these green glasses make everything look like you're underwater. And so then when you see someone stumble toward you who didn't get their mask on in time and whose lungs are being eviscerated by the breathing into this gas, which looks very much like someone drowning. Somehow that effect is doubled by the fact that everything already looks like it's underwater. So it seems to him almost as if I'm underwater with oxygen and this guy isn't. And then you get a touch of what post-traumatic stress syndrome is like, because the poem suddenly leaves the scene. Like we're right there, we're inside the gas mask. A man is dying in front of our face. And then boom, all of a sudden we're out and it says, in all my dreams. So now we're back home. This guy made it. This is years later. And notice there's no distinction. Like the visceral reality when it was happening. Perhaps a friend even stumbling and floundering toward you. You couldn't share a gas mask. There's nothing you could do. And they're stumbling toward you, dying and drowning. And then they continue to stumble toward you, dying and drowning the rest of your life, when you're asleep. And this is really what trauma is. It's the inability to process something that happens. It's too horrific. So you keep reliving it up to the moment where it's happening because you can't get past it. And that's what we talk about, triggers. It's kind of an overused word now, but you can get triggered by like there's a car that backfires in Mrs. Dalloway, the novel, and then the soldier just absolutely panics because it sounds like a shell, even though back home for months. Part of himself is just brought right back to the front by that noise. So in all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams, you too, and this is Jesse Pope, you too, Jesse Pope, you too could pace behind that wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children, ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, the dulce decorum est pro patria mori, how sweet it is to die for one's country. And Owen brings up an important point in that last sentence. You would not tell these stories to children. Most of the men and they all enlisted, virtually. It was the thing to do. They were for the game, and that's implied in Pope's poem that you inculcate this in children early on, the glory of war, so that when they're young men and the chance is there, then if they're men at all, they'll take it. So Owen's pointing out that this happens, and he's talking about himself too. One gets indoctrinated throughout a childhood. So by the time the war comes along, it's like seen as opportunity rather than the folly of countries vying for really for economic gain. And contrast, I wanted to look at a war protest poem/song from 1962, 63, which of course leaps us quite forward in this course. So I'm not going to stay in 1963, but I want you to see the difference between the hegemonic and the rhizomatic. This is a song by Bob Dylan called Masters of War, which he wrote in 1962-63. Just a little before Kennedy's assassination, things were heating up in Vietnam, what would become the American Vietnam War. Soldiers had been sent in as advisors to the South Vietnamese, but increasingly the soldiers being sent in were beginning to fight, and eventually America took over the war to back up the South Vietnamese against the North Vietnamese communists. What Dylan does, so I think picking up on the tradition of Owen, but taking it even much further, Dylan is trying to find what are the roots of war. Who are the masters of war? What is this roots we don't see? And it's not the people fighting the war, and it's not the soldier that you're shooting at, and it's not the soldier that's shooting at you, which was something that became clear to the soldiers on the battlefield, is that they weren't. If you're a British soldier, And now in the other trenches, German soldiers. The war was so relentless that it became pretty clear that it didn't much matter. Any soldier out there was a soldier, not so much German or British. And yeah, there was a sense of, okay, this is my country, I have to try and take your trench. And on their side, it was like, yeah, this is my country, I got to try and take your trench. But increasingly, there was a weird sympathy among soldiers on both sides. Like, I don't really wish you ill, but it's a war, and we're both trying to eliminate the other. And there was a very famous incident where they briefly called a truce, and both sides on Christmas Eve climbed out of their trenches, met in no man's land, generated a bonfire, exchanged gifts, little gifts of whiskey and whatnot, for a couple of hours, and then they were ordered back into their trenches, and the war began again. And that literally actually happened. So here's the song by Dylan. Now I'm going to put the YouTube clip of the song for you, and you can listen to it. But if I put it in this, then the bots might come get my lecture. But for one time only, I'm going to sort of sing it along, and I don't have my guitar, but I'll sing it anyway, sort of, and just don't tell your friends. Come, you masters of war, you that build the big guns, you that build the death planes, you that build all the bombs, you that hide behind walls, and you that hide behind desks. I want you to know I can see through your masks. You that never done nothing but build to destroy. You play with my world like it's your little toy. You put a gun in my hand and you hide from my eyes, and you turn and run further when the fast bullets fly. Like a Judas of old, you lie and deceive. A world war can be won, you want me to believe. But I see through your eyes, and I see through your brain, and I see through the water that runs down my drain. You fasten all the triggers for the others to fire. Then you sit back and watch as the death count gets higher. You hide in your mansion as young people's blood flows out of their bodies and is buried in the mud. You've thrown the worst fear that can ever be hurled the children into the world for threatening my baby unborn and unnamed. You aim with the blood that runs in your veins. How much do I know to talk out of turn? You'll say that I'm young, yeah, and you'll say I'm unlearned. But there's one thing I know, though I'm younger than you. Not even Jesus would forgive what you do. Let me ask you one question. Is your money that good? Will it buy you forgiveness? Do you think that it could? I think you will find when your death takes its toll, all the money you made will never buy back your soul. And I hope that you die, and your death will come soon. I'll follow your casket in the pale afternoon, and I'll watch while you lower down to your deathbed, and I'll stand over your grave till I'm sure that you're dead. Okay, well, I hope you like that. You can always fast forward or erase it. I will give the clip so you can hear Dylan sing it. If you know Eddie Vedder, he did a very good cover. I've forgotten the name of his band, embarrassingly enough. but it was back in the time of, Nirvana and some of the so-called grunge bands. Anyway, so that I jumped ahead kind of on purpose to show you, go all the way from Who's for the Game Boys to I Hope You Die and Your Death Will Come Soon. And notice that Dylan's entire focus is on politicians, possibly the generals, the weapons manufacturers, the warmongers, the people who are either profiting during the war or stand to profit after the war. Because for the most part, and this hasn't changed that much, the soldiers who fight, even when home, can just find unemployment and find it harder to find a job. So let's go to another poem, this one by Siegfried Sassoon, where we'll be able to see that, I keep trying to improve the lighting on this. Hold on just 1 second. Maybe a little better with some overhead. It was looking all right before, but now it's looking a little peaked. So I guess that's a little better. Let's see. All right. It's all right. It's not my Hollywood debut. So here goes Siegfried Sassoon in Repression of War Experience. It's actually called that. Now, Sassoon didn't have the word post-traumatic stress syndrome, but he, in a way, he was a much more skilled clinician than the doctors at the time. It was obvious to him, both from his own experience and those of the soldiers that he met, that they had been gutted and by experiences they couldn't stop reliving in their own heads, and some of these men would stay institutionalized for the rest of their lives. And we'll see a case of that with Mrs. Dalloway, where Septimus Warren Smith is about to be brought to an institution where it's unlikely that he would ever get out. And no spoilers yet, but that's one of the events of the novel, Mrs. Dalloway. So here's how Sassoon talks about it. Now, light the candles. 1, 2, there's them all. What silly beggars they are, to blunder in and scorch their wings with glory, liquid flame. No, not that. It's bad to think of war. So see how he presents this as a trigger. You have an ex-soldier sitting there, and a moth comes by, and there's a candle, and you're like, oh, moth, candle. Why would a moth be so close? Up, stop. Don't think about it. In other words, these men felt like moths. The glory of war that they were told about lured them to come close to this flame that just scorched and devoured them. No, not that. It's bad to think of war when thoughts you've gagged all day come back to scare you. And it's been proved that soldiers don't go mad unless they lose control of ugly thoughts to drive them out to jabber among the trees. Now, light your pipe. Look, what a steady hand. So you can see this attempt to recover. Draw a deep breath. Stop thinking. Count 15. And you're as right as rain. Why would it rain? I wish there'd be a thunderstorm tonight. This is something T.S. Eliot will pick up on in The Wasteland, when the last portion of The Wasteland is called What the Thunder Said, where it finally will rain. Buckets full of water to sluice the dark and make the roses hang their dripping heads. Books, another distraction. What a jolly company they are, standing so quiet and patient on their shelves, dressed in dim brown and black and white and green and every kind of color. Which will you read? Come on, do read some. They're so wise. I tell you, all the wisdom of the world is waiting for you on these shelves. And yet you sit and gnaw your nails and let your pipe out and listen to the suns. On the ceiling there's one big dizzy moth that bumps and flutters, and in the breathless air outside the house the garden waits for something that delays. There must be crowds of ghosts among the trees. Not people killed in battle, they're in France, but horrible shapes in shrouds, old men who died, slow natural deaths, old men with ugly souls who wore their bodies out with nasty sins. You're quiet and peaceful, summering safe at home. You'd never think there was a bloody war going on. Oh, yes, you would. Why, you can hear the guns. Hark! Thud, thud, thud. quite soft. They never cease. Those whispering guns. Oh Christ, I want to go out and screech at them to stop. I'm going crazy. I'm going mad because of the guns. Now, of course, he's already indicated the war's over and it's summer and he's at his house and he can't stop hearing the guns. So you're watching somebody who spends all along trying not to go mad, trying not to have their thoughts overwhelm them. Now, one of the things we know about trauma is you can't recover this way. You can white knuckle it for the rest of your life, but what you actually need is a safe, supportive place where someone can witness for you what it was that shattered you, so that with their witnessing, you can somehow put the pieces back together again. And this is not something that the soldiers got, because the culture was heavily invested that, brave people go and they either get killed, which is brave, or they come home brave. And there was no place in the culture to a war that shattered Europe and had shattered tens of thousands of men who came back as kind of living accusations. They would stumble through the streets. They would beg. They would be found gibbering in a public place, and they would be carted off. And this insistence that this was just a war. This was just another war. Some people didn't come back. That's what happens in wars, but it wasn't. There had never been a war like this, and it wasn't just the soldiers who got traumatized by what happened to them in the war. The entire culture got traumatized. And something. Let me give you another example. This one by Wilfred Owen. This is quite it's a simple poem in a way, but it makes it clear how a soldier who comes back from the front shattered winds up shattering or further shattering the people they love, because they're shattered. They can't come back. I mean, the romantic idea obviously is, let's say you had a fiance, and of course she's a wreck day after day, wondering if she's going to get the telegram that you're gone, or a wife, or a mom, or a sister, brother, the whole thing. Let's just stick with the fiance for a moment. So she's already gone through hell in her way by wondering every day whether you're dead or not. And then it turns out in this case you're not, and so you could imagine the joy of my beloved has survived. But what does that mean, survived? Because in so many cases the person who came back was so damaged that it was very hard to see as the person who left for war. And in many cases the soldiers had a lot of what we now call survival guilt, because the way death was dealt out was so indiscriminate. The bomb that blew up your friend could just as easily blown you up. Septimus is haunted by the fact that he asked a lieutenant to come over to see him, and the lieutenant took 2 steps toward him, and the bomb took him out. And if Septimus hadn't called to him, the bomb would have not killed him. So although Septimus knows it kind of can't be true, he feels like he killed his friend. I mean, it was that's the kind of thing the mind would bend under that kind of pressure, because you keep trying to make sense of indiscriminate slaughter. And so there was survivor's guilt. There was a sense of, why am I alive and all my friends are dead? And a sense that the fact that the fact that you're still living is a betrayal of your dead friends. Like, you should be dead too. When you all swore to be in this together, you all swore to get out of this together, and now you're out of it, so supposedly, and they're buried in the mud somewhere. And so one of the things about trauma is almost a sense that you refuse to live so that you can be a living monument to the dead who can't be there, which means you're completely unavailable to even people you've loved before and people who loved you and still love you. And that's what this poem is about. This poem is called Greater Love. And the tragedy of the poem is that here's a man whose fiancée is so happy to see him and loves him, and he loved her. And it's not that he stopped loving her, it's just that all of his love now is completely devoted to his dead friends who are left back there in the mud. So it's a brilliant poem, because you're left to we're not told the girl's point of view. We're just told his reactions to every attempt she makes to express her love for him. And in every case, he gives her nothing. Not because he's mean, not because he wants to, but because he can't. And by the end of it, we realize that the girl's crying, and even that he doesn't know what to do with. He doesn't say, "Oh, I'm sorry." So it's a heartbreaking poem because he's not being a jerk, and she's being lovely, and the whole thing is horrific because every time she offers, in a sense, something positive about her love, he can. It's a trigger, and it reminds him of how all his dead friends don't get to look at a beautiful woman. His dead friends don't get to hear the love of their life saying, "I love you." So why should he? And you can hear that in the poem. So here we go. Red lips are not so red as the stained stones kissed by the English dead. So the opening line, of course, is that this friend has nice lips and possibly lipstick. I don't know, but in any event, they're beautiful red lips, and he sees it. He's not blind, but he's like, they're not as red as the scattered blood of my dead friends. In other words, I can't respond to them. Um, and then he goes on. Kindness of wooed and wooer seems shame. Pure love, to their love pure. So the fact that you're kind, the fact that you have pretty lips, it seems something shameful for me. It would be shameful for me to enjoy that, given that they're dead, they're not here. Oh, love, your eyes lose lure when I behold eyes blind in my stead, my eyes blinded instead of mine. So his girlfriend has beautiful eyes. All it reminds him of is all of his blind and blinded friends. Then he goes to her physique. Your slender attitude trembles not exquisite, like limbs knife skewed, rolling and rolling there, where God seemed not to care. To the fierce love they bear cramped them in death's extreme decrepitude. Then her voice, so he goes through every charm. Your voice sings not so soft, though even as wind murmuring through raftered loft. So you have a beautiful voice, it's soft. Your dear voice is not dear, gentle, and evening clear as theirs, whom none now hear. Now earth has stopped, their piteous mouths they coughed. Heart, and here it's not clear whether he's talking about hers, his, or theirs. Heart, you are never hot, nor large, nor full, like hearts made great with shot. And though your hand be pale, paler are all which trail your cross through flame and hail. Weep, you may weep, for you may touch them not. So even her lovely pale skin, pale, and here there's even a hint that he can't help himself. That so many of the young soldiers were, of course, told you're fighting for your loved ones, you're fighting for your fiance, you're fighting for your mom, you're fighting for your wife, for your sister. There's a lot of war propaganda, of course, that if one were to lose, all your loved ones would be shot, raped, worse. And so it's a little like The Intended, where Marlowe also has that tension of, do you have any idea what Kurtz went through? Because he went to the Congo to try and make some money so that he'd be a little more in your standing, your class standing. There's a little bit of resentment, which I don't think the women exactly deserve, but nonetheless is sort of like, so we were over there fighting for your honor, and what that wasn't really what it was like. And so, your cross that we bore through flame and hail. So trauma becomes one of the new landmarks of literature and film. Trauma distorts the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Trauma is figured in these poems that you try and write a love poem after World War I now, and what you write is a poem about the tragic incapacity to feel anything, much less love. So it's nominally a love poem, but it's called Greater Love. It's not called I love you. And it's not as simple as like, I don't love you anymore. It's like, I don't love anymore, you, anybody. Um, Trauma removes choice because in place of coherent construction of the self, it just leaves a gaping hole. And all you can do is kind of go around and around the gaping hole. And something about trauma, it stops regeneration. Um, so in other words, sad things can happen. Bad things can happen. You can lose family members. You can break up with somebody, and it's hard. And it can be hard for a while. But there's some sense that somewhere that there starts a turning point. You start to regenerate. You move on. You may still regret the loss, but you begin to live again. It's just that trauma is unique in the sense that it destroys in a kind of scorched earth way. So the difference between trauma and something really bad happening to you is that when something really bad happens to you, you have potential to incorporate it, learn from, suffer from it, grieve for it, but also continue to live, um, but not with trauma, because it you haven't fully been able to even feel the thing that happened. It was because it's so overwhelmed any sense you had of anything that could happen. Also, it's a profound betrayal of trust. Domestic abuse or incest or um, child abuse generates trauma as much as somebody in the trenches in World War One. What's the comparison? Because it seems very different. The comparison is a daily, consistent betrayal of trust over betrayed, has no control and nowhere to run to get away from it. So child abuse is particularly horrific because it gets repeated over and over to someone who can neither stop it nor run away from it. That's what makes it trauma, because in order to survive it, you have to dissociate from it. So when you hear from abuse victims, they will often talk about the dissociation. It's like, well, it felt like it wasn't happening to me. It felt like I left my body, walked into the corner, sat down in a chair, watched, and waited for it to be over so I could safely go back into my body. And it's a brilliant strategy, and it's going to save you from going mad. The problem is that after a while, that dissociation becomes um, permanent. Um, that's what will happen to Septimus. It nearly happened to Marlowe. It's kind of happened to Kurt. It certainly happened during Gray started. It's kind of an initial trauma. You're going to get old and ugly, and he just separates. He just dissociates. I don't want do it to the painting. Don't do it to me. And after that, he can't feel anything for anybody, not even himself. And that gets us to what's typically, and I'm not going to go too much longer. I just want to introduce the very beginning of what's generally considered the greatest poem, certainly of the 20th century and 21st centuries, and maybe among the top, 10, 20 poems that we know of in the English language, possibly any language, and that is T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which is many things. Is written in 1922, so the war ended in 1919. Caligari is in 1920. The Wasteland is written in 1922. And one of the things that Eliot does is he personalizes I've said that this is the age of depression and the age of anxiety. And well, I think it's now more the age of depression, actually, but because it's now I would I think I can say this now, you'll know what I'm talking about, that the age of anxiety gave way, it was exploded by World War One. And there was a kind of cultural trauma that blew a hole in our collective consciousness. And after that, it was the age of depression. So this is a poem. The Wasteland is about this bracketed time of trauma where all the Pepsi myths, all of the ways that we thought the movement from the soul to the self was some kind of improvement, now we could find satisfaction here on this earth, got exploded. And like the boy in Araby, there was nothing to protect from the self-loathing and contempt of being a creature derided by vanity. So the Wasteland is in several parts, and Um, I want to just see if I can go to uh, the, the text itself, so I can, because I've memorized some of it, but not all of it. So the very first, um, it's written in 5 movements, and this one is called The Burial of the Dead. Now, I already told you there was no burial of the dead, that there are people, soldiers, bones of dead soldiers deep in the mud of battlefields, and there's no way to repatriate them because there's no way to tell anything from anything else. So the whole poem builds partly on the falsity, and I'm not saying anything against it, but the regrettable fact that you can go visit, and I visited my great uncle who died and was shot by a sniper in World War One, and the gravestone is there, and I can put flowers there, but he's not. He's somewhere in France under the ground. And of course, he's my great uncle, so it wasn't an immediate loss for me, but it was shattering to my great aunt, for instance, whom I knew a little bit, and she had a drinking problem and was an invalid in lots of ways. It seemed psychosomatic. So I saw that. I saw the effect on the loved one of my suddenly lost great uncle. So Eliot begins with this famous paradox: April is the cruelest month. Now, if you live in Toronto, everybody knows that's February. April is not it's never been the cruelest month. There's a centuries of tradition that if you're writing a poem about April, you're writing a poem about love, you're writing a poem about renewal. For Pete's sake, that's when there's Easter, that's when Christ rose from the dead, that's when bunnies hop around and giant rabbits give you chocolate. Um, what's not to love about April? Since when is it the cruelest month? So I'll complete the sentence. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Now, that is a description of April, but it's about as uninspiring a description as you can imagine. Instead of, oh, the flowers, it's a time for love, and the blooming, and the bees, and the... No, breeding lilacs, not even lilacs spring up out of the dead land. But that instead, so they mix memory with desire, which you'd think, again, would be a good thing. And they stir dull roots with spring rain. Isn't that a good thing? No, because this is a traumatized culture. And the last thing people want is to have their roots thaw. They're in too much pain. They want to stay frozen. The only relief is to have no spring at all. And this is the major theme of The Wasteland, which is that it's not that so much was lost. It was. It's that it was lost in such a way that nothing is growing back. I mean, so really there's a difference between losing a crop or even a forest fire, consuming, let's say, an entire acre of trees and just scorching it right down to blackened earth. That's obviously a real loss. But if you go back the following spring, you'll see bits of green shooting out and animals beginning to return. And that's what's just gone. Not this. This is wasteland. And the question of the poem is, why? Why can nothing regenerate? Because trauma is non-regenerative. It's protective. It dissociates you, but that means it removes you from any capacity for healing. There's a terrible price to be paid when something is too painful to bear. That we have to dissociate from it. It's what people sometimes call a creative adaptation. But that when it's that bad and you have to dissociate that much, you actually cut yourself off from healing. You cannot heal from a wound you can't bear to acknowledge. It'll show up, it'll be there every day of your life, but it'll always be there as something else. A loud noise, or having a terrible argument with someone when you actually don't even care what you're fighting about, or a fight in a bar, or getting drunk, or all this displacement. of anything except to feel what you can't bear to feel. So you want to be numb. So April is cruel because April starts to return feeling. And what are you going to do about that? Winter kept us warm. Another paradox. Covering Earth in forgetful snow. And that's the key, forgetful, not the snow. Much better to be frozen than to feel a pain you cannot bear. Feeding little life with dried tubers. So we're barely alive, and we'd rather be barely alive than to feel the force of returning life. And this would have been the case for so many people. There's a line later in the poem. I had not realized, Eliot says at one point, that death had undone so many. And not even just had saddened or grieved, but it just taken them apart, unraveled them. They weren't coming back together. And then the poem shifts into what appears to be a recollection of something before the war. So it's another thing that trauma will do sometimes, is you'll come up to the point you can't bear, and then you'll spring backwards to the first pleasant memory you can think of to try and get away from this approaching feeling that you can't bear. And now, I mean, this is a very complicated poem, but you got to try and relax when you're reading it. Think of this not as a poem that you're reading, but a poem where you're eavesdropping in a crowded room and you're hearing bits and pieces of conversations, and they're not even from this time. You're hearing somebody say something that they said 10 years ago. You're hearing the person next to you say what they're actually saying now. You're hearing somebody 10 years from now saying something else. No wonder it's a complicated poem, but it will help you a lot if you just think of yourself as an eavesdropper. You cannot organize this poem. It's impossible. That's the point. You're going to have to just experience its fragmentation. Think about a beautiful vase, and you call it Western culture, and then you drop it. And it didn't just break. There isn't some nice little crack where you can get out the super glue, and it's too bad. It shattered. It shattered into so many pieces. It's clearly never, ever going to be a vase again. But what happened so fast, what do you do when your life requires a vase and all you got now is shattered pieces that you'll never put back into a vase? That's trauma. And this poem is being written literally at that moment where it's like what Matthew Arnold said all those years ago. Wander between two worlds, one dead and the other powerless to be born. So the vase is gone. We know that we're going to need something. The sense of what a self is the vase. And now modern self just got dropped. It's shattered and it's not functioning. And you can't go back to the soul, and you don't know what is next. And this poem is written in that moment. So this poem's not going to take you to the other side, or it takes you almost to the other side. But mostly it's saying, look, we have to feel this fragmentation. So we've already bounced out of the first verse. April's the cruelest month. Our roots are thawing. Okay, I'm out of here. Summer surprised us, coming over the Stambergese with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. And then we get in German. Bin gar kein Russenstammler, sondern ich Deutsch. I'm not really Russian. I'm Lithuanian. So we're taking back to a time when there were still lots of monarchies. Most of the monarchies were destroyed by World War I in Russia and Austria and elsewhere. And it's a simpler time in one sense. Everyone thinking they know who they are. So yeah, translated, the sentence is, I'm not Russian at all. I come from Lithuania, a true German. Well, Russia, Lithuania, German. By the way, and Eliot couldn't know this is 1922, but one of the things that Hitler would draw on as he began to build toward a Second World War is that there were great areas that were not 80-90% German-speaking people that had once been part of Germany that were lopped off by the Treaty of Versailles. So it was not hard for Hitler to argue both to Europe at large and to these displaced former Germans that you belong back in Germany. You've always been German. You still are German. So I need to invade these new territories that got set up, and and there was, there were mixed feelings about that. Not everybody was German speaking, and this is one of the reasons the Jewish population started to get singled out by Hitler as not having a nation and as being things that people who destroy nations. They don't have one of their own. So he starts comparing them to vermin and to things and termites and rats. And this anti-Semitism will, of course, be ratcheted up to the horrors of Auschwitz and the concentration camp. So more of that later. Um, and she goes on with this memory. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, remember, he's the guy who got assassinated that kicked off World War I. My cousins, he took me out on a sled and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. The Wasteland will do this a lot. The memory. We were children, and the Archduke used to take us sleigh riding, and I was scared. It's like I had no idea what fear was. I was a kid. I was afraid of sledding, not World War One. But he reassured me. He said, Marie, hold on tight, and down we went. And it was exciting, and so she was terrified, but then that fun way of like, that was fun. Um, and in the mountains, you feel free. So who is she now? She's kind of a shell. I read much of the night. So she's an insomniac. She can't sleep, and she just tries to, she goes south in the winter, which means she goes to a warmer place. But the implication of the line, she brings the winter with her. She's not any happier there than she is here. So this passage marks the end of two happy memories that Marie had before the war. And then you get a totally new voice in the Wasteland. And this voice is almost godlike. It seems to come out of the air. And it's a kind of a thunder, what the thunder said. And it goes like this. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images. So this is a very stern voice. You could argue that it's a god, but it's almost somebody saying everything you people are doing is not working. And the reason is, what are your roots that what are the roots that clutch? Not just any, because roots in shallow soil won't take. And the culture of the 1920s, so-called Jazz Age, was, if you've read The Great Gatsby or any of these, it was a time of massive drinking and massive investing, particularly for the except for Germany, and then of course the Great Depression in 1929. So and Eliot worked as a bank teller, so he wouldn't have known in 22 what was going to happen in 29. But there was a sense, it would happen again in a way in 2008, this irrational exuberance where everything was valued for way more than it was worth. And it's a lot like, we're back to that haunting phrase, the price of everything and the value of nothing. So the price of stocks becomes completely dissociated from their actual value. And when their actual value came forth, when the Dorian Gray stabs the painting and the actual value of the stocks was revealed, the entire world went bankrupt. Unemployment went to 25% and so on. There's a hint of that here, as a warning here, one that wasn't particularly heeded. These roots you're growing aren't very good roots at all. Like you're doing the Dorian Gray thing. You're going for sensation, distraction, anything to keep you from thinking about what you're really thinking about. And that means you can't grow. That's the other reason you're not regenerating. Anytime a wind comes, you're torn right out of the ground. It's the same thing with relationships. Does your relationship have roots, or is it something just waiting for the next wind to rip it out? And why is that? Because the things to help you figure out what the actual value of things are now a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only, and here's a hint of maybe a way out of this, only, which you can also read as, but maybe there is shadow. So here's this scorched earth, no water, everything's rock, broken images, but only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Okay, what was that about? Partly it draws on a saying from the Old Testament, from dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. And I don't know if there's an equivalent in whatever religious tradition you know. That most religions remind you of this, as you came from nothing and you'll return to nothing. So the only thing that is going to matter in the long run is what is there a spirituality that transcends your moving from dust to dust. So you're born out of dust and you live and you die and you return to dust. Is that it? What else happens? And that makes us afraid. We're afraid of mortality. So this voice is saying, I'll show you your fear. It's a handful of dust. Your fear is that you came from dust, you'll return to dust, which means that nothing happens. Your life doesn't happen, doesn't matter. But he's not saying that's true. He's saying that's what you fear. And you fear it so much that you won't even allow yourself to know that you're afraid of it. So you'll pursue the next distraction. What you really have to do is return to the question of how does the fact that you're mortal affect the way that you live? Because certainly in the 20s and in much of the literature we've been reading, people try not to let it affect the way they live at all. They live as if they're never going to die, which means their roots don't clutch, and there's no water, and they're living in rubble. Why would anything grow out of that? In other words, life needs an awareness of mortality to achieve something more than itself. Otherwise, we are dust to dust. And World War I shattered our images that helped remind us that life is who you are, in connection to something larger than yourself. And if that thing larger than yourself is empty and rootless, then so are you. But how are you going to find these rooted things? Well, at least the first step, you're not going to put the vase back together. So you're going to have to return to the basic fear that is at the base of how we live, which is that we're mortal. So there is shadow under this red rock. And there's a moment in the New Testament where Christ, in setting up his new church before the crucifixion, says to Peter, "You are my rock, and upon this rock I will build my church." So it doesn't necessarily have to be Christianity, but that architectural metaphor here is you need a foundational stone to build, and it needs to be very, very strong, a cornerstone, and then the rest of the house can begin to draw from the strength. But the cornerstone of life is the fact of death, and it seems paradoxical. It's the same as saying that April's cruel. But April will be cruel if you are in denial of your mortality, because it will remind you over and over again that things die and get renewed. And if you don't want to think about that, then April will be a cruel reminder of your own mortality. So I need to stop there. I don't know how long this tape is, but long enough for now. Keep reading The Wasteland. Take a look at my text, by the way, lecture 6, because it's got lots of images in it, of some from World War I and others. So it's, if nothing else, it's worth looking at the pictures. And when we come back I will open the class this Wednesday. And by the way, the TAs are beavering away, if I can use a good Canadian verb, on your midterms. I've heard that. I haven't seen results yet. I'm hoping to be pretty close to having them by the time I open the classroom on Wednesday. I just can't quite make guarantees that I'll have all grades up and posted, but it's moving, it's happening. It's huge. There's 300 of you guys, and there's 5 TAs, and there's just hundreds of hours, and so I'm kind of like a general trying to herd cats or something. But I know it'll happen. It is happening. So you'll have to be, I hope, patient with me on that score. But I'll open the class, and maybe there'll be something to say about the midterms. But certainly I'll take all questions about what I've said tonight. And you may want to start asking questions about the final, because it is true. One of the issues of this class, of course, is that it's there are three things you get graded on, and in some classes you may have 5 or 6, but it's impractical with a class this size. I don't have tutorials and so on, so it has to be 3 things, which means each thing is weighted fairly heavily. So if you've got questions on Wednesday where we begin to move toward the final, that's okay. I don't want you to just blot everything out and just talk about midterms and finals your whole life, but we can also talk about the journals and any other concerns that you might have about how the course is going. I appreciate that some of you took up my invitation to put a posting on Rate My Professor. I mean, I don't know. It's probably, I may be asking for an invitation to my own beheading by inviting you to go there. But the reality is I don't have a live classroom in front of me, so I think it's going okay, but I don't get to read your faces every week. I don't get to sense the room. So I am looking for weird ways to find out if it's going well enough. And I know it can be a little tricky to do it in person, especially if you want to say, well, I need more of this, I need less of that. But you can put it there for now, because the problem with the class evaluations, there's nothing wrong with them, but it's too late. I mean, whatever went well, and whatever didn't. And yeah, okay, you can write it down, but it's not going to help you. Theoretically, it helps me for the next class. But that's why I'm trying to take the temperature in the middle of things, when I can. And plus, I've never taught like this, and you've never learned like this, not certainly in my classes. Okay, so goodbye for now, and I will open the class on this coming day from 11 to 12. Okay, so I'm saying goodbye, if I can find the proper buttons. Okay, bye.